and independency, we have also been able to speak or to engage in matters of credit rating and the position of Africa. We have also been able to speak about African peer review mechanism in the past, just to mention some of the some of the series we have had through ULI Africa. So I want to really thank ULI Africa for bringing very distinguished speakers to speak to us and to discuss matters pertaining to Africa integration. So today is another important day when we, under the same series of lectures, we'll be talking about who's Africa. As we talk of integration, as we talk of unity, as we talk of cohesion, how much do we speak to the theme of Africa Union? Is it something that a common person, you and I, are not the learned people, but people in the local context can speak to? In many cases, you've had several researchers saying that we are integrating government, not people. So I want to thank the speakers and to welcome them to IDS, Dr. George Mukundi, our able discussant, Dr. Oita Etyang, my colleague and a longtime friend, Professor Patrick Maluki, and our moderator this afternoon, Dr. John Njoka, for agreeing to spearhead this seminar today. So we are very delighted as IDS, and I want again, on behalf of the Institute, to welcome all of us to this platform and to wish everybody fruitful engagement and discussion. And without any further ado, I invite Winnie just to say a few words about ULI and then hand over the mic to John. Thank you very much and feel welcome.
Thank you very much, Professor Kamau. And just to disrupt the monotony, because I've been in the previous ULI forums and Fred was not around, I'll hand over the baton to Fred so that Fred can say a bit about ULI, and then we go on with the seminar. Thank you. Fred, over to you.
It's easy to say Africa is complex. We say that. It's more difficult to mean it. The fact is, the state in Africa is young, and so is the market. But society is old, yet it's fractured, it's strength. Africa is complex. It's more complex than any other human ecosystem. So, we, the so-called scholars, what can we do about it? That's what inspired ULI Africa. We said, we are going to take on reality without compromise. We are going to be interdisciplinary and do so brutally. Do not.
Mary, can you please? Mary, can you?
Someone needs to mute. Okay, let me be quick. I was saying that Africa is strongly complex. Africa, okay, let's just take a pause and have some order, then I can continue.
Basil, can the whoever is anchoring this mute people, maybe at this point? Thank you.
Okay, Prof. Thanks. I'm doing it now.
Okay, Fred. Fred, you are mute.
You are
Fred,
muted,
you are
Fred.
mute. You are muted.
He also adhered to muting everyone. Sorry.
And someone decided to mute me. Now I think I can do it quickly. So Africa is complex. That is not just a chorus. The state is young, and so is the market. Society is strained. And we have to be brutally interdisciplinary if we're going to take on the challenges of Africa. Now, what we sit and say, well, we've got African universities, let them sort it out. No, a bunch of us said, okay, let's get together. Let's have a loose network. Being loose means being agile. We can jump in anywhere, and that is crucial. So we, and I can say we are most grateful to IDS for being with. We are going to do a few good things in the days ahead. We are going to take on the reality of Africa in a brutally interdisciplinary way. And we think the doctoral student in Africa, the graduate student in Africa, all of you doing your masters, you'll see the collaboration between ULI and the universities of Africa now being cut beautifully by IDS. I want to think you'll see us as a companion, a place that will make a difference, deep difference to you as scholars of tomorrow and scholars of now. Thank you, Paul, and thank you.
Russell, what's happening today?
I have muted everyone because I noticed someone was talking to us a lot of cucumber there. Nothing wrong with the cucumber.
Mute everybody until later on when we finish and people can be unmuted. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, Prof. We are trying to deal with this, please. I'm so sorry.
So Basil, can I take it over? I see a friend finished.
Yes, please.
It's over.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Friend Amonya, for introducing ULI, and thank you, Professor Mitura and Professor Paul Kamau, for also saying your opening remarks. I have been given the work of moderating this session, and as you noticed from the introduction, this is supposed to be an open forum for all of us to share our insights. Based on the guidance of the presenter, George Mukundi, and the discussant, Oita Etyang, and Prof. Patrick Maluki. I will start by calling upon Dr. George Mukundi. We will give each of them, the presenter and the discussants, maximum of 15 minutes. But if you use 10 minutes, the better. And so I will quickly introduce Dr. George Mukundi. He's an adjunct professor of public law in the Faculty of Law, University of Cape Town, and Strathmore Law School in Strathmore University, Kenya. He has a bachelor's degree in law from the University of Nairobi, master's and doctor of law degrees from the University of Pretoria, and a master in public administration from Harvard University, Kennedy School of Governance. Mukundi served as the founding head of the Africa Governance Architecture, AGA Secretariat, within the Africa Union Commission. I'm sure when he starts, he'll tell us what is that, because that is very important in the discussion. And so when Dr. Mukundi is setting the pace for this, he is the right person to do it. Over to you, Daktari. You can talk to us, maximum 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Professor Njoka. And let me first begin by thanking the University of Nairobi, especially IDS, for this invitation, and for everybody who's tuned in from wherever you are for this particular seminar. It's always exciting to come back to the academy to discuss and share some ideas that of course, I mean, I'm quite glad when I had Fred and of course Willie, who are very good friends of mine, share their ULI idea and how they came up with this. I mean, I must also give a lot of credit to Professor Karuti Kanyinga, the former director of IDS, who convinced me that I should already be able to come and share some of these ideas. And I must first, begin by stating clearly that it's not necessarily the only ideas that exist on this topic. And I know many of you, of course, share some of the ideas. You might have some diversity. The lens I bring into the picture, as Professor Njoka says, is one where both as an academic, but also as someone who's worked within the system, within the AU, where I spent about 5 years at the African Union, heading the African Governance Architecture Secretariat in 2012 to 2016. Give me some insights in the internal dynamics of trying to bring together various mechanisms and institutions as we were celebrating 50 years of the Organization of Africa Unity and the African Union at the time, 10 years. And beginning to ask ourselves, had we made any inroads? Had we made any progress? And when we look back, where are we going and what's the status of affairs within our union? And this is a conversation that continues. I mean, now it's been almost 10 years again. So we are, 60 years plus of the founding of the AU. And I think this topic cannot come at a more timely time where we are saying, are we actually, the owners of the union? The same questions that, of course, are beginning, or in fact, have gotten a lot of momentum at national level. And I guess perhaps, if I may, the discussions that are happening at the national state are the same conversations that perhaps maybe even ignited this particular topic where we are asking ourselves, whose state are we? Whose Kenya is this? Is it ours, our institutions, especially the three arms of government, that's Africa, the parliament, and of course the judiciary, but it may be also the executive. Does it represent what the people are asking? And it's where I began my key message, which perhaps maybe that's where I should begin, even as I structure some of my thoughts. And I know some of you would have expected perhaps a PowerPoint, but it might derail the discussions. And I think this is an open conversation. And I'm quite happy, of course, to see my very good Professor Oita, who I've worked with, especially from COMESA, as one of the discussants, because he heads one of the regional economic communities. So it's one of the organs or one of the institutions or the African institutions that perhaps brings into the table most of the ideas that we are asking ourselves. And so he might be able even to respond much better than I would, in the sense that he sits on the table at the moment to try to galvanize how the people are part and parcel of the continental mechanisms that are influencing and shaping the way into which we see our union. And I think perhaps, in terms of Kenya, and I know there are many other people in the meeting that are listening from different places on the continent, I think the discussions over the last couple of months where our former Prime Minister was running for office to head the African Union Commission may have, reminded people of the existence of the African Union. And I know that's a question that was being asked by Fred, but also by Paul. Are those the only times where we remember that we have a union, besides, of course, our countries where we belong to, where one of our own is a candidate? And to what extent did the running of Prime Minister Raila Odinga galvanize Kenyans, both positively and maybe negatively, and excited them to understand and appreciate what the union is supposed to do? And are those the only times where citizens then rally and begin, asking themselves the questions whether the union is serving them or the union is serving those who are running those particular institutions? And we've had quite a couple of prominent Kenyans, Mwencha himself, Erastus, who served for 2 terms. And again, thankfully, he actually also used to be at COMESA. So again, my colleague, Dr. Oita, again, where he was a secretary of COMESA, before going to the AU, would then actually give us some ideas about what are the people, at least from the Kenyan perspective, who serve those institutions, to what extent do they deliver, not just for themselves as individuals, but also for our own as a country, but to citizens over and beyond our union. When people are asked about, who the African Union is, we remember often the summits that happen in Addis every 2 times in a year. At the beginning of the year, the media, which I think recently, there is what they call the Media Coordination Summit, which is supposed to bring together the regional economic communities, and where COMESA then maybe then sits in terms of the reality. Those summits, what do they bring to the table for people? The discussions that emerge from those spaces, are they serving the purposes and the pursuits that have been designed for our institutions, and the mechanisms and the frameworks, and including the instruments that found these institutions? Because, of course, beyond the Commission itself, there are many organs: the Pan-African Parliament, the African Court, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, and there are many, NEPAD, APRM, which I will not go into the details, making an supposition that few of you perhaps maybe have read or have an idea about the African Union, as it were, because this would be an entire seminar on its own. But the question that I think that is at the heart of our question is that when the organizers asked, whose Africa is it? And how do we bring those continental organs to the people? So who is bringing what? And who's Africa, and who is asking that question? I think it's perhaps more important questions, in the sense that when one thinks that at the state level, there are the 3 key ingredients of what constitutes a state. Of course, the territory, the people, and a government. So can there be a state without the people? So in other words, then, if there can be a continental organization without the states, so the people, which is the 3 key, or the third, or one of the second most important ingredients of a state, if they're missing in the conversations, or even in terms of shaping how those institutions are being organized, can there be a continental organization? But thankfully, again, I guess, both the founding instruments, that's the OAU Charter at the time, and of course now the AU Constitutive Act, and in the recent past, what we perhaps maybe credit Madam Lamini Zuma when she was in charge of the AU, as we celebrated 50 years, what we call Agenda 2063. They went to the heart of it to then say that the union must be at the first and foremost be one where it's people-driven, which is called aspiration number 6. So that Africa's development must be people-driven. But is it people-driven? And how do we mean by people-driven? So when we ignore or fail to heed to the needs, the aspiration of the people, the voices and the wishes of these individuals, and the constituencies that bring these people, we've learned, especially as Kenyans, it comes bubbling to the surface. And without getting into the Kenyan politics, and even the politics that are perhaps maybe spreading like wildfire across the continent, we are learning increasingly that Gen Zs, young people, women, persons with disability, but even academics and even human rights organizations and even actors, they will actually then be asking critical questions to the state, and the state either learns how to listen to it, but the agitation and protests will, end up being to the extent that we are questioning the legitimacy of the state, because sovereignty lies with the people. And equally, I guess, perhaps then that's how we then take it to the next level, even as a continental organ. And so I asked myself 3 questions. Why is it that we must bring, and where do we need to bring these institutions to the people, if we have to be brought to the people, if they are not already the ones who actually should be able to actually ask themselves that question? Because the reality of it, as we know, yes, indeed, that we should not be bringing it to the people, because the people indeed are the institutions themselves. But we've learned that for the last many years, as most academics have written, that we see these institutions perhaps more as an assemblance of the leaders of the countries that serve us when they meet in those particular mechanisms or organizations without necessarily reflecting the needs and the aspirations of our people. So that's one of the questions that is being asked. So why do we need to bring it back to the people? And what will be the purpose and the rationale? And the second question I think that we must also be able to address in this particular meeting is, how do we bring it to the people? From where and where were they? If indeed they were anywhere else, if not perhaps already part and parcel of those institutions. And how then do we claim this our continent? Now, I argue 4 points on the why questions. One, I guess, and I'm mostly guided by Agenda 2063 and its 7 aspirations, including all the 15 flagships, is that the Pan-African dream and valid of Nkrumah, Kenyatta's and others, Lumumba's and many of their others, Thomas Sankara, and many who led, including Nyerere, they were asking different questions. And of course, without going into the politics of the different groupings, whether it's Casablanca or Monrovia, where there are, of course, differences in terms of approach of the space and the faces and the approach into which we then realize Pan-Africanism. At the core of the OAU, or the organizations that we then call the African Union, or the entities that bring together continental institutions, was to fight for independence and self-determinations. But the truth is, many have argued it's not yet Uhuru. And, whether it's Odinga himself, when he again made that claim, many of the academics have also still said, yes, we may have gotten political independence, but we still have not yet self-determined ourselves. We've not yet reaped the fruits and the benefits of that Uhuru. What does that mean? So if indeed that many years after, 60 plus years after the organizations of these institutions were founded, that we have not yet realized the core essence. And again, that also goes even at the national level, that yes, we have political power, but we still don't have economic power. We don't have economic means, our livelihoods, access to jobs, access to sustainable, decent livelihoods still remains a mirage for most of our people. Emancipation of the African people. I'm often reminded by a very beautiful poem of a Ugandan called The Song of Lawino. That, this woman, claims that, leave me alone. After all, the Constitution says so. So she does know that there's a Constitution. So she's asking the state and others who continue to berate her and, make her struggle many years after the independence in Uganda at the time when Lawino by Okot Bitok was writing at the time that, yes, please leave me alone. In any case, that's what the Constitution says. In many of our countries, we are asking ourselves that, yes, the Constitution says so. So why don't you leave us alone? If indeed you can't do nothing, then just leave us alone. Now, on the question of regional integration, which is again one of the core reasons why, again, the institutions have been established. And we're asking ourselves, how have we realized that? Many people across the continent have again rallied and said we should be able to go anywhere we would like to. Not, of course, without passports or without some legal protocols being followed, but that we should be able to trade, we should be able to integrate, we should be able to politically mingle as much as, Professor Fred was talking about Africa being complex. It's also very diverse. It's also very dynamic, but it's also evolving. It's not what it was in the 50s, in the 60s. It's not even what was in the 90s. It was not even what was in the 2010s when we were again redoing the Agenda 2063. So what has shifted with the Gen Z protest, with the Gen Z agitation, but also that the young people are now hungrier. They're demanding their rights perhaps way differently from how we even used to argue and call for those issues. Of course, yes, the AU does then provide some mechanisms, including the Protocol on Free Movement, also brings together what now we celebrate the African Continental Free Trade Area, the single African airport transport market. But to what extent have those really again been realized? Of course, there's significant progress, but there's more that can be done. What is there for the people to be able to do that? But also what we call collective self-reliance. We are seeing across the continent, across the globe, from the US, from North Africa, from Northern Europe and others, the continued, nationalistic tendencies that are beginning to ask ourselves on what extent should we be engaging these actors. And so we're being asked to do more with what we got and organize ourselves, not just to fund our own initiatives, but actually also to claim both in terms of peace and security, but also the many other issues that as Africans we imagine what them brings together. How do I see some of the steps that perhaps have been done and could be done maybe better to bring these institutions together for the people? I think, as I stated earlier, Agenda 2063 is a blueprint for the continent that clearly outlines different things that could be done. And we're in the second decade of its implementation. And I think especially as academics, IDS and ULI, we should be able to, again, reflect better. And I know there's a lot of work Professor Karuti and Winnie and others have been doing through the Afrobarometer work to track progress on these issues. But we can't, again, only wait for the person who is supposed to be delivering these issues. The same way when you think of Kenya, when we imagine essentially just perhaps in the parliament, an organization, like I think Mzalendo, that tracks the progress that's being made even in parliament, that we must be able to account and ask for how much progress is being made, as opposed to just realizing and listening to what the leaders are telling us they'll be able to realize. Because many individuals at the continental level, but also at national level, are asking whether there is any utility for any of these institutions. I think one of the missing links that we've seen, including the reforms that have been instituted, is that most of them have actually focused on what we call institutional or operational reforms. And yes, at the national level, we always ask for constitutional reforms. But how is it that then, many years after, say, for the AU, which is 20 years, and as I said, with the changing in the dynamics, the changes, of course, in the evolving and diversity of our people, the changes even in terms of how young people and everybody, individuals are approaching these issues, are they still fit for purpose? And to that extent, are we following a flow diagnosis and prognosis of the solutions? And if indeed that's the case, what then needs to be done? But there's less appetite, of course, to go to the structural core reforms that are important. So there's a significant, of course, rigid preoccupation with issues of sovereignty, egalitarian principles, which I know many, of course, including Nkrumah at the time, was saying, even a small country of just a million people should be compared with a country of 120, 200 million people like Nigeria. But I mean, does that still exist and does it work? And where it hasn't, what could be done? And I leave it as a question because I don't want to already preempt some of my own thinking. But of course, the issue of centrality of citizens, and of course, we have the Pan-African Parliament, we have ECOSOC, and we have some of those institutions. As I said, aspiration number 6 really says that the AU or the institutions that we've developed at a continental level should be people-driven. Are those two mechanisms, which perhaps are the ones that have been anchored to deliver citizens-driven processes, doing enough? Or can there be any more than others? Those are the periphery. Can they be brought to the inner core of a system redesign and the reforms? And what would that look like? And again, I will leave that again also for our own discussions, because of course there's a role that ULI, IDS, Afrobarometer, and think tanks and universities also can be able to do. But we're also learning different ways in which young people are organizing and agitating and calling for those reforms. Now, are we likely to also equally see beyond the national state equal level of excitement and equal level of interest by young people to call for reforms, call for transformation, call for solutions, and the centrality of citizens in these issues? Of course, the level of awareness. I mean, and I stated earlier, beyond, of course, the run by former Prime Minister Raila Odinga in Kenya, where again we learned a lot about, what's going on at the AU. How many, of our grandmothers in the villages know about the African Union? Does it matter for them? What does it do for them? if at all there's anything that it does for them. Now, the AfCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, is being touted as one of the game-changing elements that perhaps maybe because of trade, the free movement issues, the regional infrastructure, because when one looks at all the 15 flagship initiatives of the AU, other than one which is on peace and security, the rest of them really covers the essence of Uhuru, the essence of delivery of socioeconomic, sustainable development, which of course is a significant shift from back in time when we were more preoccupied with political independence and those elements. The issue of digital revolution, the issue of arts and culture and infrastructure, Ingadam and others. So how much do we know the 15 flagship initiatives of Agenda 2063, and to what extent are we actually also asking ourselves, why is it that we are preoccupying ourselves maybe with 2 or 3 or 4 and not the others? Is it an issue of resources, or is it because that we don't think these are necessary and important, and allowing external actors to be able? Before I close, I have 4 points I would want to close with. That not controversial in any sense, but I think it's also maybe a call to action. That yes, indeed, and I think it's interesting and that we get to rally and get a lot of interest when there is candidacy of our individuals in these institutions. But we're also learning that, unfortunately, half of the individuals that end up being in those spaces are not necessarily the most qualified individuals. Not to state anything here on behalf of any country or on behalf of any of those particular individuals, but I mean, perhaps political rejects, if you like, perhaps individuals who either have, not necessarily succeeded at the national level, but being then taken to those spaces almost as a reward for not having, realized their own national interests. And I know, very recently our own Minister of Foreign Affairs or Cabinet Secretary for Foreign Affairs was again discussing the issue of a rethink of how then we are deploying our own diplomats. Because again, it's an issue of diplomacy, it's an issue of international relations, an issue of international law and those kind of discussions. So to what extent do we offer our very best and very qualified? What's the role of universities to, I just read now, Professor Bitange Demo being appointed to be the Vice Chancellor of the University of Nairobi. Exciting times, because I mean, most of us who know Professor Bitange Demo is a fellow who at least have done quite a little bit of his work. And of course, maybe I might be biased, but it'd be a very interesting space and time to also learn to what extent Professor Bitange Demo is going to do at the university. Because I mean, University of Nairobi, where most of us, of course, studied, we're asking ourselves at IDS, at ULI, and many of the other universities, whether the University of Cape Town, Strathmore University, and many other universities, are we also giving our very best individuals and people who are qualified and allowing them to be able to exercise leadership in those spaces? Because where they have succeeded, we are able then to see significant progress. Nigeria, at least if you look at, or at least Rwanda, 2 of the individuals who almost everybody can remember off their heads, the current president of the African Development Bank, the former president of the African Development Bank from Rwanda, are individuals we know they've achieved something. I mean, to what extent can we equally say the same of our own people? Of course, as universities, the issue of generating and curating knowledge, that also is a little different from the traditional media and research papers that covers books to the new media and the new ways of learning. And I think this seminar is a very good testament that, we're able to bring a diversity of individuals. I know my very good responder to this call, I think, is a political scientist, and my background, my leaning and my biases is towards using the law as a solution to most of our problems. What people say, if you give, someone who is fighting a spider hammer, they'll just use it to hammer whatever they see. So we see law as one of the solutions to many of the issues. From political scientists, they look at it differently. So it's very exciting and useful to see how regional integration causes issues that to deal with regional union issues also then can be brought together. How do we engage and collaborate with Pan-African voices through the Pan-African Parliament, of course, through, of course, again, rethinking how the Pan-African Parliament is organized, how people end up being in those spaces, not just individuals who are being rewarded, or being given time to go spend some time in Midrand, to the very best of our people, so that they are shaping the laws and the models, but also giving it the legal capacity and power to make laws, just as we do at the national level. Because the problem, of course, is not the solutions or even the strategies or the laws, is the implementation is part one of the biggest challenges. How is able then to qualify, implement and follow through some of those issues? The ECOSOC, which is a significant institution that I think has been revamped significantly. Pan-African Lawyers Union, different individuals and others that are also doing some work. And then finally, of course, that we are only able to bring these individuals or even these institutions together if we actually ask for our own accountability, we demand for it, and we pursue it, both in terms of the results and what they promise to do. And I use, again, Afrobarometer, I use also Mzalendo as two of the key elements that I know, at least in our own areas, they've been useful in the very end. I close with a quote that I learned someday, because, again, of the current things that we are seeing, not just in our own country, but also across the continent, that the beginning of the end usually is the day when we start seeing human rights and fundamental freedoms being breached by the state with wanton abandon. It's from one of the resolutions of the UN Security Council. And I think it's a very useful testament to the challenges that we currently face, and why indeed that we cannot continue to have in South Sudan, we cannot continue to have in DRC, we cannot continue to have in Sudan and others. Without, of course, then also understanding that we could easily get there. And if we don't get there, how do we not get there if we in fact have our own regional institutions? I thank you, and I hope we can have some interesting dialogue. Over.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mukundi, for that elaborate sharing. And I will not summarize it because it is very clear about the limited knowledge about our union, and also the importance of different actors like universities, research institutions, think tanks, and all that. But also the primary role of also young people and citizens in general. Without further ado, and Dr. Mukundi, I urge you to look at the chat box. There could be issues that you can want to speak to later. So at that note, I would like to introduce the first discussant. We have two of them, Dr. Etyang and Professor Maluki. I will start with Dr. Oita. Etyang is the head of governance, peace and security at the COMESA. I think everyone knows what is COMESA. And he has over a decade of experience across sub-Saharan Africa, covering the whole spectrum of conflict and fragile management. He's an expert in system peace building, strategic conflict analysis, conflict structural vulnerability, and resilience assessment. Dr. Etyang has been involved in cutting-edge research whose outcomes have shaped policies and enriched academic discourse, both at the national and regional levels. He holds a Master of Arts in Political Science from the University of Nairobi, and also a Master of Arts in Managing Peace and Security in Africa from the University of Addis Ababa, and a PhD in Politics from the University of Johannesburg. Dr. Etyang, welcome to speak to the audience, reflecting on what Dr. Mukundi has said. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, moderator, and it's a pleasure to be in the same midst with Professor Winnie Mitula, one of my mentors when I was in the university doing my master's. And it's also lovely to reconnect with my good friend George Mukundi, who we have journeyed together in terms of promoting the African agenda. Having said that, I think it's important to highlight some of the fundamental issues that George has also touched about as we talk about taking the Africa Union to the people. And more fundamentally is the issue of ideology that George talked about. And you can easily see in connection of the ideologies that George was talking about with the formation of the OAU. And the OAU very much tried to succeed because of the ideological underpinnings that were being championed by different leaders then, and that gave it the pedestal that it required to deliver in terms of its objectives. But having said that, we see that the transformation of the OAU to AU in 2002 did not have that ideological underpinnings. There was no rallying call that was to take us to the next level. While the OAU had achieved the political kingdom that Nkrumah talked about, the march that came with that political kingdom had not been achieved. And that is what the AU in 2002 tried to, or was supposed to achieve. But we see that the coining of the developmental aspects that the AU was supposed to drive from 2002 was not backed by an ideological backing. And that could explain why there was no rallying call that could bring both the African leaders and the citizens to move and pursue those aspirations that the AU in 2002 envisaged. I agree with Professor Mukundi that there is a knowledge gap among our citizenry when it comes to knowing what the AU and its organ are all about. This could be deliberate in the essence that the AU, as currently constituted, seems to serve the elite interest. In essence, one could classify it as a club for mutual protection, especially of the political leaders, and that has created a gap between the leaders' aspirations are supposed to be achieved, while the various AU instruments, and Dr. Mukundi talked about the Constitutive Act, if you look at the Peace and Security Protocol, all underscore the importance of involving the citizenry in the affairs of the African Union. Despite the fact that these frameworks underscore this noble idea or agenda, we find that there is a disconnect between the AU engagement with the citizenry. And in most cases, if you walk on the streets or engage citizens in different forums, they will tell you that the AU is unknown. It lacks relevance because it's not delivering the political kingdom that our forefathers envisaged. They feel that it remains a club of a few elite, and that is because it has failed to drive the people's agenda. Dr. Mukundi talked about the institutions of the African Union. And more importantly, I think the institutions as currently crafted are not geared to provide a platform for citizens' engagement. And that is why there's been a call for reforms of these specific institutions. And if you look at the framework that Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, who was a champion of AU reform, provided, the main goal was to, one, make the AU relevant to the citizen, and secondly, was to ensure that the citizenry engage more proactively in the AU's affairs. And I agree with Professor Mukundi that it is extremely critical that we relook at the AU institutions and organs and make them pro-people, make them to respond to the challenges that the current communities, the current local communities, the current citizenries are facing, more especially the young generation that Mukundi was talking about. They need employment, they need space to thrive, they need space to realize their full potential. And I think by reforming some of these strategic AU organs and institutions, they will be able to proactively engage with the citizenry. Specifically of importance to me is the Peace and Security Council. And I've singled out the Peace and Security Council because it is the only decision-making organ of the African Union. As the Peace and Security Council currently constituted, is it able to deliver effectively on its mandate? The AU Peace and Security Council so far has made almost 1,600 decisions. Have those decisions been implemented? And if you look at the core principles and values of those decisions, they are anchored to provide services, to provide relief, to provide a platform for citizen engagement. How many of them have been implemented? And my argument here is that we need to reform the AU Peace and Security Council for it to be proactive, for it to be pro-citizen in its approach, especially on issues of peace and security. The Peace and Security Council needs to be proactive. It doesn't need to be reactive to issues as they emerge. And then we also need to deal with the issues of competing interest within the AU Peace and Security Council. Having said that, how can we take the AU to the people? One, I will ride on what Dr. Mukundi talked about. There's need to understand the AU. And that is why the academicians, universities in this context, ECOSOC and civil society organizations need to play an important role in ensuring that the local citizen understands what the AU is and what it's supposed to do. There is weak information flow from the AU, and I think this is where the AU needs to pull up its socks and leverage on technology and the social media platforms to enhance outreach, to educate, to advocate on what the AU is doing. I also think that it will be important for us to strengthen the relationship between the AU and the RECs. And this is premised on the fact that the RECs are near the member states, they are near the citizenry in terms of implementing various programs. And if we can facilitate that strong engagement between the AU and the RECs, then we'll start having a meaningful conversation.
I'm losing you, Dr. Etyang.
We can hear him. Maybe, yeah, we can hear him. Maybe it's on your end. I can hear him.
Okay, I'll check my system.
Thank you. So I was saying that it will be important for us to strengthen the coordination between the AU and the RECs in terms of implementing the various programs that are meant to benefit the African citizenry. And this is premised on the fact that the RECs are more closer to the citizens, they're more closer to the member states, and that synergy or that congress between the RECs, the member states, and the citizen will be critical in terms of taking the AU to the people. I also feel that it is important for us to have champions. If you look at the OAU then, if you look at the initial or the nascent inauguration of AU organs like NEPAD, we had champions. We had people like Thabo Mbeki, we had people like Olusegun Obasanjo, we had people who could champion the interest, and you could see the Pan-Africanism in them in terms of propagating what was good for the African citizenry. So for us to be able to take the AU to the people, we need champions. And these champions should have an ideology that they're driving in terms of driving the AU agenda, that is focused on the African citizens. We also need to move away from crafting policy and legal frameworks documents. My friend George comes from a legal background and said that to him, the legal framework taking Africa to the African people. But I feel that we need to move away from crafting. The problem we have in Africa is not the laws, they are not the policies. Very good policies have been crafted at the continental level. But the question is, do we implement these frameworks? Do we implement these frameworks in a way that the citizens desire, in a way that it speaks to the needs? And the answer is no. And most framework to implement, to monitor the implementation of some of these frameworks that we have developed. So it's my submission that it will be important for us, civil society, academia, the REX, the AU, to come up with a framework that will help us to know if we are really speaking to the needs of the citizens, if we are really addressing their challenges. And finally, I think it will be important to address the issue of sovereignty if we have to take the AU to the people. In most cases, and as George talked about in the summits, it's the member states that participate in these summits, is the few elites' interests that are discussed in these summits. Where is the voice of the local Wanjiku? Where is the voice of a local Tendai? So it will be important, and I think it behooves all of us to start rethinking on how to engage with the AU, and the AU need to start being responsive to the interest of our citizens. And I will end by saying that it will be important for the AU to become a union of the people, and not just a union of the states and governments. And for the cliche of Africa solution to Africa problems to have a meaning, then it should be accompanied by African resources. I submit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Etyang, for the reflections on what Dr. Mukundi presented, and especially also for leaving us with the other recommendations or takeaways that we can reflect on. I will also request you to just a quick look at the charts because there are questions which are being raised there and reflections, because I will give each of the speakers some little time to reflect on those issues and questions. I'll now go to the last but not least speaker, also a discussant, Professor Patrick Maluki. He's a holder of a PhD in Peace and Conflict Studies and a master's in International Studies, postgraduate diploma in Mass Communications, and a bachelor's degree in Education, experienced trainer and researcher in diplomacy and international conflict management, international negotiation, mediation, human rights, and governance and peace building issues. Prof is the director at the Institute of Diplomacy and International Studies in the University of Nairobi, and is the chairman of the Foreign Service Academic Council at the Ministry of Foreign and Diaspora Affairs. He is the chairman of the Diplomacy Scholars Association of Kenya, and editor of the Africa Journal of International Studies. Professor Maluki is also the associate editor of the IDS. IDS is the Institute for Diplomacy and International Studies, Journal of Diplomacy and International Studies. He has authored several books on peace building strategies and sustainable peace in Rwanda and Burundi, combating new piracy in the Indian Ocean, role of parliament in peace building, the Indian Ocean Rim, under cooperation and community and communication strategies in disaster management. Some of his book chapters include Building Trust in Post-Conflict Societies, the Human Rights and Peace Building Lessons Learned in Mount Elgon, in Bad Anderson, Etyang, Poverty and Human Rights, 2017, by Focus Publishers. Then Piracy as a Threat to Maritime Security in the Indian Ocean, in Makumi Mwagiru and Apiraja Biswas, editors of the East Africa India Security Relations, Nairobi, IDS Priasa, The Implications of Al-Shabaab and Small Arms and Light Weapons in Security of Horn of Africa, a focus on Kenya, in Vidya Jain and Matt Mayers, editors, Ujama, Connection Contemporary, Africa, Asia, Peace Making and Non-Violence. I've said a lot about Prof because it's good to give credit according to what has been shared with us. So welcome, Professor Maluki. Take some 10 or 15 minutes, please, to speak to us about the reflections. Thank you, sir. Karibu.
Thank you. Thank you very much, moderator, and good afternoon, everyone. And it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to this esteemed audience on a subject which is very, very important. I want to appreciate the interdisciplinary approach that this dialogue is taking. As you've heard from my profile, I am from the International Studies discipline, and therefore I want to have my reflections majorly tailored on this direction. I think the question of African Union and where we have come from and where we are is complex, and this was said in the beginning, and it's true. And I want to appreciate George Mukundi and Oita Etyang for these very, very captivating reflections. You've really digested this subject, and I'm sure all of us are benefiting out of this. But allow me to say that from where I stand, we know that coming together of countries, regionalism majorly, has been always based on two major factors. There must be push factors and pull factors. And for the African Union, I think we started with the push factors. Where did this idea come from? This idea majorly was foreign. I mean, we all know the history of Pan-Africanism. It dates back the period of Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois in the US. They talked about Black consciousness. It is the Black consciousness that led to the clamor for independence in Africa. What was the clarion call? That the belief was that Black people had a shared history and a shared destiny. Maybe this is what we should be asking today. Do we still have a shared destiny? Because this could be some of the structural problems that the African Union could be suffering from if we have moved from the push factors, which pushed those scholars and leaders, who organized the Pan-African Congress of 1900, the Black Africa Movement, the 1945 Manchester Congress, the 1958 Accra Conference, culminating in 1963 OAU, where now we became a union. And so the push factors were really strong at that time. But progressively, and up to 2002, I think the push factors were replaced by factors. And these pull factors have not been as strong as the push factors. And this is why it has become an academic question. Where are we? What is lacking in the journey towards regional integration in Africa? And therefore, if we don't get this contestation, then we may be blaming some of the issues like institutions, when actually there's a more overarching, challenge to the entire push towards regional integration in Africa. And so my submission is that what pushed Africans to come together somehow has waned out progressively. And we saw one of it was the call for independence. When many African countries, of course, now all of them are independent, they got independence and the dismantling of apartheid regime in South Africa. You find that the push factor that used to galvanize, the leaders, and then of course disappeared. And this has led to, less commitment, less motivation. And what needs to be done is now to build pull factors. What is it that we need to do so that anybody, identifying with Africa is happy and proud and sees value of the African Union? And because one of the challenge that we have to address is it beneficial? And this is a question of whose African Union are we talking about? The question of ownership and the role of citizens, is because the pull factors are very weak. And probably this is where the academy may need to assist the policymakers. How do we recatalyze the pull factors such that we have something that holds the masses of African continent together? They feel motivated to integrate, to move together. So I think for me, this is exactly one of the structural things that we have to reflect on as academics, so that when we design institutions, when we reform the institutions, we are reforming them with a purpose. Because from a very, academic point of view, one can ask, where do we want to go with this regional integration? What do we want to see so that we say that we are now successfully integrated? What exactly is the end game? What's the end state? Are we envisaging Federal Republic of Africa, really? And then if not, what exactly do we need? So there's what we refer to as a minimalist approach to success and maximalist approach to success. But these different ways of measuring success will depend on how strong the pull factors are. How strong do we feel? Do we see the benefit of the African integration? And so our work as academics, in my opinion, I think we need to center on that aspect of making the African Union work for everyone, have it indigenously, kind of moved and governance based on the need of the common person. And I think this is the gist of George Mukundi's, discussion. And so if I can reflect on one theory that normally is useful in our discipline in assessing, the value of integration or cooperation. We have the cooperation and anarchy theory. And cooperation and anarchy theory has been used by scholars to look at how, states can come together in a national system that is anarchical, and where maybe there's no, a moderator or maybe a lawgiver. And one of the provision of the theory is that it argues that if cooperation is to occur, then you must look at the structure of payoff structure. The payoff structure, what accrues to the individual state in the entire journey of cooperation. And when you look at it, then you may find out that most of the African states have no direct benefit that is seen to come from the African Union on a daily basis. Majorly what we have done is that our countries have invoked the organization in times of crisis. When it becomes necessary for you, you say, okay, now, in line with the African Union, and I want to cite the example of Kenya. We benefited so much from the African voice during our ICC, when our leaders were arraigned at ICC. And therefore, the African voice was sought and a lot of solidarity. But after that, what else? And so we may need to examine the payoff structure of the regional cooperation on a day, on a year, continuously. Excuse me. And then the other issue that comes from the cooperation and anarchy is what they call the shadow of the future. What is the end game? Where do we go? How long are we going to be engaged in this? Is it one-off? Is it going to be for a long time? And so when do we want to see this integration? and at what level we want to. So milestones, we need to have very clear milestones so that even as we start discussing whether or not, then of course there is the target that we see, this one we have missed or we have not. At the moment, I don't think the institutions that we have, have been established, but without a clear, focus on where the end game will be. And this, for me, has been one of the challenges of how to measure whether we are moving forward, we are stagnating, or we are backsliding. And then, of course, we also must be very conscious of the number of players. How many are we? How many are we? 24 states? It's not very easy. And so even as we lament and say that, things have not worked, it is also to look at the structure and the environment where this regional integration is expected to work. Galvanizing the objectives of 24 states, it is not very easy. And probably this may require that we devise other approaches. For example, I've just seen the chart that we may need to approach our integration from a regional perspective, the RECs, the regional economic community groups. And then we integrate from that level, then we expand on that. So some of these structural issues have been really challenged, and until they are addressed, maybe by policymakers as well as by academics, it may not be easy for people to see the value of this continental push. And so what Mukundi has done is really to excite us on what is not there and why we need now to put something on the paper and look for tangible outcome out of the efforts that has been put by African leaders. But my argument is that unless we have a concrete end state where we want to take this, and we have concrete, yardsticks, milestones that we need to see, A, B, C, D, up to this and this, then it may not be very easy for us to come up with a complete, assessment as to whether, because maybe there are some members of African Union who are very happy. As long as I've used the African Union to really get to the leadership of Africa Union Commission, that's all. The rest is not very necessary. So this diversity of objectives has been a major challenge. We've never had one focused, objective as we used to have when we had the push factors. The push factors had very clear end game. Consciousness of Black consciousness, which we have attained. Then, of course, independence of Africa, which we have attained. But the pull factors are still very weak, and they have not been well concretized, so that we can say this is exactly what we. And this has therefore made us to have this kind of academic discourse of engagement. So our shared destiny. To what extent, therefore, can we today argue that all the 54 countries have a shared destiny in their international life? Okay, there are those who have other, connection, the other loyalties. The loyalties are divided, and so while some people are pushing a lot of effort on the union, others have a divided commitment. And it becomes difficult, and you feel that you could be spending a lot of energy on something where your other partners are not. This is for real, and we cannot shy out of it. So my concern and where I'd wish to academic work to be directed is how to really make sure the pull factors that make us feel Africans, that make us want to focus on African Union, are made stronger so that they can now generate achievable targets, and we can now talk about domesticating these policies to the rest of the African citizens. I want to submit and say thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Prof, for that introducing us to the pull and push theory, and also the interests of each country when they are coalescing around the African Union Commission and the African Union in general. At this point, I will go straight to looking at the chat box, and I will be calling upon the speakers according to the way the points have come across. Quickly, I'll try to read them so that then we use this. I think I see a question which was by Humbert Wamalwa. I like the inspiration. Oh, Wamalwa, do you want, I saw you had two. Do you want to speak to your two questions very quickly? Then I go to Professor Mitula, then we stop at that. We hear those two. Probably yourself, Professor Mitula, and then Francis Ngoge had several questions in that order, because I think it is good if also people voice their questions quickly. Just summarize them.
Yeah, thank you very much, moderator. And I want to join you in appreciating the speakers and also the discussants. Yeah, so mine was because the title of this seminar was "How do we bring the AU to the people?" And so I think when the first speaker was speaking, Dr. Mukundi, he mentioned that one of his aspirations is the inclusion of citizens. But then I really wondered, do we actually have a place for this? Is the AU structured in such a way that, and especially when you talk about citizens, the people, I am thinking, the common African citizens, not the elite, not even us as academia. So do we really have these kind of structures? And I was just saying, for instance, in this country, in Kenya, our constitution actually anticipates this. And now I'm connecting it also to the issue of the policy. People need to be involved in issues that concern them. And you can be petitioned, you can be sued, you can be challenged if this has not been done. But is that possible at the AU? And then my second related question on policy was just on the issue of policy coherence. Can we talk about policy coherence on various issues of concern in the African Union? And I was just saying, if you pick challenges such as unemployment, it's an African problem. Do we have a united voice on this? If we talk about the scramble for Africa that we are seeing and the consequences that come out of that because of the wars, do we have one voice at the policy level, which is supposed to translate to action? Thank you, Chair.
Oh, you have seen me showing my video, I want to stop you.
Yes.
So that is one question, and I'm actually persuaded that we may not want to go that route of everyone with a question speaking. You can mute yourself. We may want to probably make it faster, because I see our time, we only have 10 minutes away. Probably we can give a minute or two very quickly to each of the speakers in the order in which they started, because I am reminded I did ask them to look at the chat box. That might be easier so that someone can speak, because like the issue of citizen and civil society participation has been asked by several people. And I think Dr. Mukundi can speak to that, having worked in the AGA. And the rest can also follow, picking one or two questions which they can speak to. Dr. George Mukundi, you want to go first?
No, thank you very much, Professor. And again, thanks to all the colleagues for all the questions that you've asked. Perhaps even before I begin, there's a very interesting proposition that was made by Professor Maluki about the push and pull factors. I think it makes an interesting point, just that perhaps maybe to say that I would equally then also add that this is not something new, and I don't necessarily actually suggest or even want to imagine that the question of Pan-Africanism and the whole idea around the African Union and OAU, it was actually an external idea. Sheikh Anta Diop in 1946, 1960, when he was writing, I think in Paris at the time, in what now we know is his book on Towards the African Renaissance, which is, of course, something that has picked up much, much later by many others, including, of course, the former president of South Africa, Mbeki, Mele Zenawi, Yoweri, President Kagame, Obasanjo, and Abdoulaye Wade, again, have been some significant discussions and ideations. It doesn't originate externally, I think, and it's something that really is among our people. It's something that also subsists even today, and not even there's a whole idea about Pan-Africanism is that every human being, every African citizen, young or old, they hope tomorrow will be better than it is today. Now, how do you achieve that? I mean, of course, yes, we always imagine first from our local levels at the village level, at the national level, or at the county level, at the state level. And I think the whole discussion that we've been having today is to ask ourselves, is there still utility for something external that is beyond, of course, our nation state? And I think there is, especially for many of us who believe in the idea about the African Union and the organizations of different actors, including the REX, and totally adhere to those foundations issues, is that we must perhaps begin, especially for the questions that was being asked on the policy development, but also policy coherence, is that perhaps maybe also manage expectations. Now, I have argued, and I think I must have stated that earlier, that look, the AU or the organization and the regional institutions, continental and otherwise, are essentially a reflection of the state of our nation states. And that's where it begins. So if we have challenges at the national level, if you have challenges at the local level, we do not necessarily expect any different from the continental level because we are diverse even at the local level. Equally, we do not expect that we even agree on almost all these issues. So any ideation that we'll agree on any particular subject matter wholly is not necessarily realistic, I think. But perhaps what could be done is what then you're arguing around the policy coherence issue. And there have been many, many attempts. In fact, the current clerk to the Pan-African Parliament, who was an advisor to the former chair of the African Union Commission, was leading the work on policy coherence. So of course, African governance architecture, the whole idea around coordination and policy coherence is one of the key issues. And many of the other actors, especially even the coordination summit that again became part of the Kagame reforms, to bring together the issues of the various institutions that exist, because there are just so many institutions at the AU level, and people are asking, are they useful? Are they satisfying what we had designed them for? And I think the jury is out, and I think that's the discussions that we can have as academics. But perhaps maybe putting in my legal hat just slightly, because I think it's important, is again to be reminded that we can't run away from international lawmaking. We can't run away from international policy making, because the unfortunate part, and that's again, the tragedy of course, the Treaty of Westphalia and Versailles and others, that the making of policies at that level, again, is a preserve of the state. That's the reality of it. So which means, and I think the question was asked by somebody, that do we then expect that citizens will be there also then making those policies? Unfortunately, you can contribute to them, but the people who will be negotiating and arguing all these issues as our representatives. And this is why I spoke about the issue of leadership. Who are the representatives that are representing us in making sure that they articulate the issues that we then imagine should be the ones then that address some of those issues. So issues of diplomacy, issues of state, and of course the various interests of various actors, whether internal and external. And again, we've seen a lot of external interest again preoccupying even how we debate these issues, where we are beginning even to see the union not necessarily even being able to be the one advancing the causes and the interests of our people. The negotiations are being done, whether it's in Washington or they're being done in the Arab countries, on issues that should be the ones being done by our own people. Why is that the case? Because again, remember, there's not just issue of resources, but because we failed in a sense to address some of the issues of our people in a manner that the states and the representatives that are being able to, and I think Dr. Oita spoke about the role of the Peace Security Council, but also the role of those mechanisms and institutions to be able to address those issues. So I think that's, for me, the key. If I don't say anything else, I wanted to say three things. One, the question of accountability is one that we must, again, emphasize. And how does that look like? Beyond, of course, citizens being able to use the media and new media tracking dashboard and academics and in writings, it's something that we have to think through how we bring those institutions to be accountable to the people, even when we are not necessarily the ones addressing those issues. The second one, and I really, again, will emphasize, is the questions of leadership, exercising leadership and adaptive leadership. The role of citizens, of course, just in terms of nominations, because as I said, what reflects at the national level, who are we when we nominate individuals to represent us, those individuals, can only be done at the national level. Because once they then end up, whether it's judges, whether it's the commissioners, whether it's the various representatives that are being able to serve our people in those spaces, first must originate from the national level. So to what extent are we able to do that? So finally, I think is, again, the issue I spoke about managing expectations. We must all realize that the AU does not implement. That's not how it's designed. And I know the question was raised earlier, of course, by Oita, who says that, is it by design? Of course, it's by design. It's not by accident. Now, why is it the case? Now, that's the tragedy of commons. That's what it is. So if they cannot implement, who then tracks implementation? And where does implementation lie? Now, that's again an issue that we should be able to then say, to what extent can citizens make sure the tracking of implementation at the national level, because the state is the one that implements these issues, is the one then that reminds people of the role of the various resolutions and mechanisms that have been able to be made, including the decisions at that level. Over, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mukundi. Without taking more time, over to Dr. Etyang to just give quick reflections on those questions, then we go to Prof. Maluki.
Thank you very much, Doc. I'll go to Professor Winnie Mithula's question on the engagement between civil society and the AU and the REX. And I think ECOSOC is the mandated AU organ to galvanize civil society voices and engage with the AU policy organs. And if you look at the institutionalization of ECOSOC, while it took a long time to activate that policy organ, I'm happy to inform you that now it is up and running and it's headquartered in Lusaka. And there are frameworks that have been put in place to streamline ECOSOC engagement or civil society engagement with the AU policy organs. There is the Livingstone formula and the Maseru conclusion that provides a very robust framework on how civil society can engage with not only the AU organs, but specifically the Peace and Security Council. Simon asked about or mentioned about decentralization of the AU policy organs. I totally agree. That is the way to go. We have to decentralize these organs. I long for the day I'll see the AU Peace and Security Council meeting in Goma and engaging with citizens in Goma in terms of their challenges when it comes to peace and security. I know that they went to Port Sudan last year, but I want to see that more. And I think through that, we'll enhance engagement between AU policy organs and the citizens, especially those affected by conflict. Dr. Amonya asked about the AFDB. Where is the AFDB in all this equation? The AFDB is supposed to anchor and provide resources that will help the AU and the REX, deal with the needs and the interests of the citizenry. But the first question I'll ask Dr. Menya, that who are the top shareholders of the African Development Bank? You'll find that out of the 10, 5 are not African countries. And as the adage goes, EU pays the piper, calls the tune. In terms of the policy organ, I think Dr. Mukundi ably answered that. That was the question asked by Albert. I submit, Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Etyang, for that, especially also for referring people to the ECOSOC, and also posted it there. And also there are M&D frameworks on the Agenda 2063, which you can check in the AU website. This information is available. Professor Maluki, there were questions asked to you, sir. Can you kindly reflect quickly on them?
Thank you very much, moderator. Yes, we have a question from Professor Mitula. Yes, about the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation as an SDG goal. Very true. That of course Africa is not delinked from the rest of the world, and therefore the global agenda applies to Africa. However, you know, even as we implement SDGs, the bottom line of our conversation this evening was, how do we bring people closer to the union? What has been the missing link? And here now we go back to my argument of pull factors. And I'm reminded of some of the contestation, even within the African citizenry. Recently, we experienced xenophobia in South Africa. Africans, you know, are ejecting fellow Africans. Where's the problem there? What exactly? It's because they don't see the utility. They don't see the value. And my argument has been, unless we make the pull factors very attractive, so that I see the value of defending a Ugandan and bonding with a Somali citizen. I see the value of me going to stay in Tanzania for some time. I see the value of marrying a lady from Nigeria, and I feel African. I think this commonness, you know, the Ubuntu philosophy that has always been a champion to, you know, characterize our ethos. Unless we strengthen on these common bonds, then whatever structure that we may put in place may not be very relevant. And therefore, my argument is that whatever reforms we want to do must be focused on enhancing the value, the utility of African Union to the common person in Africa. And so that I will feel proud when I say I have journeyed to Rwanda and I came home happy. I had the seamless, you know, experience, travel journey. But where you get even moving from one border to another one, there are handles. And I'm happy someone has just put that most of the institutions are state-centered, and therefore it is the state which decides. So we need to recalibrate the way we are structuring the institutions, the way we have approached regionalization in Africa, and domesticate it so that it focuses on the common person by making sure that it is an attractive movement to the common person. It can only be attractive if it is of value, if it brings what I was calling the payoff structure. You see the benefit of traveling to Ghana and staying there for 2 weeks, you know, but we still have a lot of, you know, disparities, a lot of misperceptions, and we have maybe approached African regionalization based on experiences of other parts of the world, ignoring what may be indigenous to our societies. So the common person was left long time because the structures that were put in place at the beginning were not majorly homegrown. They were actually pushed to us by the factor that existed by that time. And so we need now to rethink and restructure and have developed home, you know, full part homegrown, you know, reasons why we want to integrate. And that way we'll be able to have actually people fitting very well within the African Union movement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Maluki, for that reflection and re-emphasizing the pull factors and bringing back the union to the people. At this point, before we close, I'll invite a gentleman who has been working on bringing citizens closer to the AU and working with ECOSOC and all these organs. Very quickly, just to comment on something around that, and probably reflect very quickly in a minute. Douglas Wanja, I saw you here. You want to take a minute?
Yes, can you hear me, Mwalimu?
Yes, I can hear you. Continue.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And first and foremost, I would like to appreciate IDS for this auspicious moment and opportunity for us to continue to have discourse on the African Union. And above all, to thank my friend, Dr. George Mukundi, who I've managed to meet on various occasions while working with AU organs through the Data for Governance Alliance project. And I think also for his conversation and candid that is live, and the fact that many African citizens today continue to reel from the fact that they feel so disconnected from the union that they call theirs. My name is Douglas, and I'm so happy to also be here in capacity that have also had an opportunity through IDS to be able to work with closely 99% of all the African Union and the AGA Secretariat through the Data for Governance Alliance project that sought actually to bring the African citizens closer to the people, to the Union, through the civil society wing, where we were just trying to work closely with the African Union. And actually in that project, Data for Governance Alliance project, whose phase one has just ended, our main focus was just to ensure that we brought the citizens closer to the African Union, but through the civil society organization. So I have really enjoyed this conversation, and I can tell you that I have not even stopped taking notes while I was listening to Dr. Mukundi talking about these things. And perhaps maybe to make a quick comment, in the Data for Governance Alliance project, my biggest lesson is that indeed it is true that the union is so distant from the citizens. And maybe our African citizens, who are over 60 of us here, because we are the people who should be talking about the African Union, most of us here have actually been very distant from the union. And the fact that we are so distant from the union can actually be attributed to so many things. And I think one of the things that I have learned through the Data for Governance Alliance project is that the African Union continued to be distant from the African citizens. Because most of the documents, most of the charters, most of all the engagement platforms, for instance, in English, in Arabic, in Portuguese, but I've not seen any document translated in Swahili unless you go to the African court in Arusha, where they try and translate some of the documents in Swahili. I've not seen some of the documents written in Xhosa. I've not seen some of the documents written in Kapa. I've not seen some of the documents written in all these African languages, because one of the ways that you can endear yourself to the citizens is speaking the language that they understand. And I think that is one of the biggest missed opportunities that the African Union continues to miss. The other thing is that most of the African Union, and I like what Mukundi here said, that sometimes it can be viewed as a club of the elites, where you only deal with diplomats. Whereas we know that the African Union has so many opportunities to be able to solve the real problem. So I think one of the biggest opportunity again is being able not to involve the young people, because Agenda 2063 will only be the preserve of the young people who are being born now, the Gen Zs that we have. We cannot have people who are 50 years old. I don't think they will be able to reach in 2063. So we cannot be talking about the future of 2063 without engaging the young people. And again, I challenge the young people in this platform, for example, you cannot want to be connected to the African Union yourself, but you don't even understand the documents and the opportunities or the avenues in which you can engage with the union. Another missed opportunity that I think also the African Union continues to miss is being able not to be interpreted to us by the respective member states. I think not many governments are there trying to implement what the African Union are saying. Most of the African governments are very busy implementing their manifestos, and the elites are even very busy doing their 5-year manifestos, other than not talking about Agenda 2063. As a young lecturer, I really struggle even today to teach my students Agenda 2063, because most of them don't understand, and these are university students. Some of them don't even understand the new, for example, AFCFTA, the new trade bloc initiative. So again, it is also up to us to have this conversation with the young people. And I'm happy that now the conversation is becoming louder and louder. It's not recently we talked about how we fund our union and how we are going to be independent. And now we are talking about who is Africa. So again, when we talk about the African citizens themselves being very far away from the Union, the question is, how far are they? And how did they get far? So that's also some of the things that we need to talk about issues. So another thing that I also think that the African Union misses as a unity is to be able to maybe sometimes to respond to the pressing issues like coups, displacement, the wars. I think the African Union sometimes sits on the fence. And this is some of the places where we expect the African Union to become strong and say that. And as I finish, Mwalimu, and thank you for the minute, I think I also challenge the people who call themselves the African Union, because you can't sit in the high offices, which are actually very scattered across the continent, and expect to have an impact of 1 billion people in the African continent. So I call my rally call to the African Union, and I've invited quite a number of them in this platform, is that they should find ways in which they are going to decentralize and localize their organs. We need to have more liaison offices in the member states so that people can understand what the African Union is doing. We have these organs scattered across the continent, like we have the Banjul Commission. If an African citizen wanted to interact with the Banjul Commission, they have to do 18 hours to go to the Banjul Gambia. But what if the commission has decentralized itself in some of, like in our region or here in East African region? So I think there is so much that we need to do as a continent. The African Union cannot be our union when we cannot be able to speak to it. The African Union cannot be our union if we African citizens cannot be able to fund it. So I did thank you all, and I thank IDS for this opportunity to go to bring these conversations about the African Union, because we, over 70 of us here, are the African citizens. So my running course to all of you, talk about the African Union to at least 5 people, 300 people by end of today will have known about the African Union. I thank you, Mwalimu. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Douglas. I broke protocol, but then I thought what you are sharing is actually first-hand information, having worked on also what you are doing earlier than before you came in. And at that point, I will seek the guidance of Professor Winnie Mitula. I think we should be closing now, whether she wants to hand us time, or Pascaline, or whether we...
No, we take it back to Pascaline.
Yeah,
thank you.
Take it. Yeah, thank you, Prof. So we take it back to Pascaline to close for us, or rather to do the final motions. Thank you very much, everyone. And I believe this is not the last of the series. Dr. Amunya has put in the link to ULI so that we can join and continue with that conversation. And also, Pascaline, I'm sure she will share, or she has shared, the link to continuous IDS seminars for these sort of conversations. Over to you, Pascaline.
Thank you so much, Mwalimu Njoka, to our speaker, Professor George Mukundi, to Dr. Etyang, to Professor Maluki. We are so grateful, and to all of us for making this happen, for keeping the conversation going. We have our next seminar on 29th this month, on Thursday, same time, 2 p.m. East African time. And they will be sharing the details of the theme of the seminar and the Zoom link. So from us, we want to thank you so much. We have recorded the conversation, and we have a YouTube link. You will also be able to access and follow the conversation via YouTube. So thank you so much, Mwalimu Njoka, and good afternoon. It's a good evening to all of us, and we stay in touch. Please write to us. The email is ids@unbi.ac.ke or director-ids@unbi.ac.ke. I'm just going to type that in the chat, and thank you so much. Bye-bye, everyone, and please share your email addresses with us.
Bye, thank you.
You want to stay in touch. Thank you. Goodbye. Thank you so much, Professor Mitula.
Thank you, bye.
Thank you, Fred.
Thank